You know what you can do in the future, is you can actually just delete out the audio file.
Oh yeah, I guess you could just so you just take out that. Oh yeah, and then you just keep the same Audacity file, but the audio is gone. Oh, that's smart. And
Yeah, but I, being the editor,
no, that's smart.
I yeah. Now, dude, now I'm like fucking with sound levels and stuff.
We're
Like it's
getting
great.
professional here.
That's right. Okay, welcome to Ad Hoc Degeneracy, a show where Josh and I bet on the future. Earlier in the year, we did a podcast on the Brazilian election. Sadly, due to copyright claims, that is not a public episode.
Only for the
However,
real heads.
if you wish to ever.
Only the real heads. Only the real
What's
heads
that?
get access to this. Our deep cut, our deep and prophetic takes on the Brazilian election.
That's right. So, if you ever demand receipts, like, we have them. But until then, like, we'll just keep it private until we can actually afford the licensing fees for the songs we used.
It's a
Um,
Patreon exclusive for the foreseeable future. In our non-existent Patreon.
yeah. Whenever we get a Patreon, we'll we'll let you guys listen to it, our faithful subscribers. That having been said, I think one of the most important things that we can do is actually go back and review our predictions to see how well we did, to understand what we did well, and more importantly, understand what we got wrong, so that we can be better in the future. Um, all right. That having been said, Josh, what happened in Brazil in October 2022?
There was a series of elections in Brazil. They chose a new president as well as their elections for Congress, their legislative body, their upper and lower chambers. Most importantly, is that Lula won. The incumbent Bolsonaro was defeated, and so this is signaling a pretty significant change in the direction in Brazil. And naturally, Eric and I placed bets on who we thought would win. The presidency specifically, we didn't bet on lower races, but we really were focused on the big one.
Yeah, the presidential election of Brazil. So that having been said, Lula won. So that means that we would assign a 100% probability to that happening. And how correct we were, we do our percentage minus how wrong we were. So I predicted that Lula would win. I predicted there was an 85% chance Lula would win. So that means that I was 85% right. Josh, what percentage did you assign to Lula?
I gave him less. I gave him just a 75% chance of winning. So I got a
Okay,
75 on this exam.
right. Correct. I got an 85. You got a 75. So that means, so neither of us predicted with 100% certainty that Lula would win. So we are not completely right. We are only partially right. So, that having been said, let's first discuss what actually happened, and then let's discuss the implications to see where we went right and where we went wrong. Um, as Josh alluded to, Lula won, but that's not the whole story. So, what happened in the first round and what happened in the second round? Josh, do you want to break that down for
Sure,
us?
sure. So in Brazil, their presidential elections work quite a bit differently than in the United States, for example. They don't have a electoral college or anything like that, and the nature of Brazilian democracy means that there's just a lot more political parties that have a chance of winning, and often they work in coalitions with other similarly aligned groups. So in this instance, Lula was elected, but he didn't win on what they called the first ballot. So to become the president, you have to win 50% plus one of the votes. to win. And so if no one gets that amount, they have a runoff between the two top candidates. And so in this election, I mean, a lot of the polls that we had seen were predicting Lula would win, but I think it was a lot closer than people predicted. I mean, obviously he didn't win on the first ballot, so they had to have a runoff election several weeks later where he was ultimately able to win, but he didn't win in a landslide. It was actually quite a close election, closer than I think many had predicted. Even us, I think, to some degree, although I guess I was probably more. I was more pessimistic, I guess, than you were about Lula's chances.
Yeah, you were more right to call it a close election. So, all right, and let's break this down. Instead of just saying, well, it was closer than we realized, let's actually like get some numbers out there. Lula won the second round with 50.9% of the votes and 60 million votes in total. Bolsonaro got 49.1% of the votes and 58 million in total. So Lula won by about 2 million votes. That sounds about accurate.
Yep. And it's important to note, too, as well, that in Brazil, voting is compulsory. So if you're wondering why those numbers seem pretty high for a country with, I think, about 150 million people, that's because you'll get in trouble if you don't. You can obviously invalidate your ballot, but everyone between the ages of, I think, 18 and 70 is required to go to the polls come election season.
Okay, you said the hot topic. Voting is mandatory. What percentage of voters do you think voted in this election?
And that didn't spoil their ballots?
Correct.
Like I would guess like 99.5
Lower.
That voted? So that voted and
that vote. What percentage voted out of 100% of voters that should?
Oh, I'd guess like I said, like over 99% because you get fined otherwise.
So I'll give you I'll give you a little bit of a help. 2.82 were invalid. 2.82% were invalid. 1.59% were blank. So that's 3.3.
Oh, sorry. No, I was counting. So I was counting everyone who, like, the people who I was thinking of was like people who were fined for not actually showing up.
Right. But what was the turnout? So I'm saying that's like that would be what, a 97.7% turnout, but it was actually lower than that. How much lower do you think it was?
So this is, sorry, again, we're factoring in people who didn't vote for any of the two candidates. Oh, gotcha.
Right.
Oh, that I would say is probably more like, I don't know, 14%, something like that, 15%, maybe as high as 20.
High. Okay, so by 15%, you mean 85%
for one of those two candidates, yeah.
Candidate. You would go as low as 80?
Yeah, like maybe as low as even 78.
Okay, keep going lower.
Oh, interesting. 70.
Oh, wait. Actually, never mind. It was 79 and 79.
Oh, nice. Well, my 78 was close. I mean, it took me a while to get there, but so basically 22% of people, or 20.5% of people didn't want to vote for either Bolsonaro or Lula.
Correct. So here's what's really interesting. Actually, and this is a huge side tangent that we're going on, but it's fine. What percentage of people in the 2018 election do you think voted for either candidate? So that was the year.
Yeah, I'd guess it was like way higher, probably more like 30, 35.
That didn't vote for either candidate? Lower.
Oh, so probably in the 40s then.
Or sorry. So you're saying 40.
So initially I was going to say like 33% of people picked neither of the two options.
Right. So you're doing the inverse, which is fine because now we know that. Lower than
so more like 40% of people. So I guess which is easier to go by, the people who didn't pick anyone or the people who picked someone.
So you're saying 30% of people didn't pick anyone. It's lower than that.
So let's say Low, sorry, higher than that or lower than that?
Okay, so here's what's going on.
It's
Defining
important. You got to
terms.
get those terms
So
defined.
lower. So you're saying 30% didn't pick either one, and I'm saying lower.
Ah,
So that means that the number of people who picked someone is higher than that, which means you need to lower
right,
your number.
right. So more like 25% or something like that.
Lower.
Less than 20?
20.3,
Interesting. So almost the same as this time.
almost the same as this time. So, all right, here's really fascinating. You're like 2018, like probably not a lot of people like Bolsonaro, probably not a lot of people like the other guy because of Operation Car Wash, right? 2022, kind of a similar situation. So let's talk about 2014. What percentage of people in 2014 do you think did not vote for any candidate?
Oh man, I'm gonna guess it's the same. I'm gonna guess that trend continues. So 20.5.
You're really close. 19.3.
Interesting.
Yeah, so almost exactly the same.
That's an interesting thing about Brazil that I didn't really appreciate before, is that there's this pretty consistent block of people that just aren't interested in the leading candidates. I guess if they're, and this is, I'm assuming this is on the second ballot, so it's like their own candidates get knocked off and they don't want to participate anymore.
They're within, so the first and second ballot are within 1 to 2 percentage choices of each
Hmm.
other.
Interesting. So there's not a lot of swing voters in that sense.
Not a lot of swing voters. Here's another really interesting thing. What percentage? I'm trying to think of how to ask this. How often has the person who's won the first round lost the runoff in Brazil?
Uh, how often? Meaning how many times in say the past since there's been democracy? So since what was that, 80 mid 80s? So
Yep.
that's going to be about that's about 40-ish year, well 35 40 years, so that's probably about 10 elections, let's say, or let's say 8 elections. I'd probably say 2 out of
Two.
those.
I actually let me check the 80s. Let me check the 80s numbers really quickly because it hasn't happened in a while. If it has happened since 1990, it's never
Okay,
happened.
there you go, there you go. That's probably when there's probably only been elections since 90, to be honest,
It didn't happen in '89.
which would have been a weird transition election, I'd imagine, because they're every 4,
Yeah.
so I'm just thinking
Um,
thinking back.
did it happen in 90? I don't think it happened in '94.
Oh, what was the name of that guy who won? Oh man, that was a long
Off the
time ago.
top of my head.
I guess it's not important.
Fernando Henrique Cardoso.
Yes, Cardoso. Yes.
Crushed. He crushed Lula. It didn't look like there was a runoff in '94.
So he went on the
So
first
it
ballot.
didn't happen. Yep. I think every time the person who's won the first ballot has won the runoff. As I'm going through Wiki, Cardoso won. Absolute. Oh, oftentimes. Okay, so oftentimes there hasn't even been a runoff because they've just won the first round. So, what's also really fascinating about Brazil is like when people get elected, they seem to get elected with these really. They seem to get really strongly elected, if you know what I mean. Like there have been the percentage of close elections in America, a larger percentage of them have been close.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really interesting point about what's going to come next in Brazil, is that you have this very polarized electorate in a way that you may not have before, and it's going to be a different environment for Lula to operate in, where he doesn't necessarily have the huge mandate that he did in his previous election wins, and he's going to have to move to the center in a lot of ways that may dampen his supporters' enthusiasm. Who knows? Maybe it may limit his effectiveness just to govern, but he's going to have to involve the military more in his government in ways that maybe he wouldn't if he had a very strong mandate. That he's going to have to appeal to business interests and not necessarily conservatives, but the center more than maybe some of his core supporters would like. So that's going to be an interesting thing. I think interesting thing to watch is how he navigates those relationships.
Yeah, so I'm gonna make a note that I think we should look up, and that is what policies did Bolsonaro start that Lula will have to continue? Because I'm really curious about that. Like, because we are okay. So another thing that we didn't mention too, um, who, which party actually won Congress between Lula? Who won Congress between like Lula's coalition or Bolsonaro's coalition?
It was the coalition led by the Liberal Party, which is technically Bolsonaro's party, I think. We'll edit this out if
Yeah,
I'm wrong,
they
but
crushed it.
that was my understanding. Is that they?
You're
I don't know
right.
that it's a huge in the lower house in their Chamber of the Deputies.
Yeah, they crushed it in the Chamber of Deputies. They picked up 43 seats in the Chamber of Deputies.
Mm-mm.
And the Brazil Union Party, which is kind of like, and we'll edit this out if I don't remember correctly off the top of my head, but it's kind of like, it's somewhat of a Lula's party, lost 30 seats. The Progressistas also picked up 21 seats, and I believe that they are fans of Bolsonaro. So if you're looking at Bolsonaro and his allies, they picked up 64 seats in the Chamber of Deputies. Huge win for them.
Yeah, which I think complicates the way that Lula will be able to do his job, and some of the promises and the expectations that people may have, I think, will be tempered quite a bit by a Congress that's more conservative than he's had in the past.
Right. And so really what this election's saying that I think is really fascinating is like Brazil seems to legislatively prefer Bolsonaro's party, which is why they picked up so many seats, which is why Bolsonaro and his allies picked up so many seats in the most recent election. They just didn't like Bolsonaro they just didn't like Bolsonaro because he wasn't reelected.
Yeah, for a variety of reasons that we can kind of unpack if we need to, but I think it's kind of an issue with, as you said, his personality and him as a candidate, and less with the policies that he put forward, because obviously he's very quirky and weird and believes a lot of weird stuff, but believe it or not, cutting taxes and opening up not necessarily opening up the Amazon, but his approach on reducing social spending and that kind of thing, is still quite popular among certain parts of the electorate.
Right. So could you say that like Lula's a winner in this election?
I think you still can, him personally, although I think you could also say that the PT party or even progressives broadly in Brazil are maybe the losers. Because they've lost control of the chamber, they don't control the Chamber of Deputies, but also Lula is going to have to tack to the center, which means that their expectations of broad social reforms and improvements in social spending may not be as robust as people were thinking about. So he himself, I mean, he's a president, right? I mean, I think he won, but progressives in Brazil maybe not as successful.
So I'm going to put like defined terms because the issue with using progressive is it's like very North American centric, but there's a party in Brazil called the Progressistas.
Yeah, that's different. So I guess I mean leftist. I guess I should just say leftist.
Yeah, that's probably better. Just because if you say progressive, people are going to go look up the Brazilian election, they're going to see the Progressistas and then they're going to be like,
Yeah. Sorry, no, that's a good point, and that's a very, very, very important point actually, because I think in the Latin American context, yeah, it's not, you're not necessarily you're like a leftist. It's communist. It's socialist. on that side of things.
Right. And I think really too, Lula is very much a winner in this election because he couldn't even run for the last
Yeah.
one because of Operation Car Wash. So he's essentially gone from like the most popular politician in the world to a criminal to president again. Like what a hell of a ride. What a what an up down up situation.
That's Brazil, baby.
That's Brazil. However, like you said, his party is clearly a loser in this
And
election.
even like again, like to reiterate, because the party politics, are quite different there. I'm also mean just leftists in general in Brazil.
Should we say like the Lula coalition?
I would even say even leftists, because there are obviously leftists who think Lula is kind of a fraud too, who may have voted
Okay.
for him, but
So we'll
like
just
thinking about like hardcore Bernie Sanders supporters to Biden, right? Like they may have voted for him because he was the Democratic incumbent, but like they still don't like him.
so let's say all right, let's just use
I
leftists
think I
then.
think that's a good
So that having been
catch-all.
said, so okay, so you're talking about Lula being a personal winner, his party, leftist, not so much. Bolsonaro. Is Bolsonaro a winner in this election?
I think you have the reverse phenomenon here, where Bolsonaro is clearly a loser, um, where he is personally unpopular, he's out of power, but his ideology and his policies are, and his own, the right in Brazil is much more empowered. So it's kind of opens up a lane for even challengers to him. Although I think he's still personally popular enough that he may, stick. I mean, assuming he doesn't die, because he's had a lot of health trouble. Like he may stick around for another election, but he's vulnerable now in ways that he maybe hasn't been in a while, and that opens up, someone who can maybe deliver on more of those right leaning policies and programs.
Yeah, the saga of Donald Trump will be really interesting because I think both of those candidates will rhyme with each other. Like, whatever happens with Donald Trump in his 2024 election
Mm-hmm.
bid will be really similar. So, Bolsonaro's rise was really similar to
Yeah.
Trump's. And if they rose in a really similar manner, I would bet on them falling in a really similar manner. That means that, like, the Republican presidential election coming up that's already kind of started with Donald Trump announcing his election super early. If he wins that election again, and man, if Donald Trump wins in 2024, we could see we could see Trump and Bolsonaro again.
Yeah, that even just him running again and having the courage to run it. Well, I don't know, courage might not the right word, but the the temerity to run again. I think that's going to encourage Bolsonaro to, even though Bolsonaro didn't stage a coup against Lula. I mean, he, if he'd had more military support, he maybe would have tried, similar to what Trump kind of tried to do.
Yeah, you got to kind of wonder if the difference between like between what happened to Brazil now and the reason why they lost democracy 40 years ago is just the military understanding that they don't necessarily like being super in charge.
Yeah, heavy is the head that wears the crown, as they say.
Right. Right. And like I don't know, I think about this a lot with the war in Ukraine. Like the single most unpopular thing anyone has probably done this century is Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah, I think the Iraq War kind of probably runs a close second. Yeah.
So the
In
Iraq
hindsight, I think the
war,
Iraq War is probably less popular, but I think at the time, like 6 months out, I think you're probably right.
Right. And we can only say the Iraq War is a close second with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
But from start to finish, it's clearly Russia invading Ukraine. And so you have to wonder if like the military looks at things like that and then just says, "Oh, we don't really want to we don't want any part of this. Like we're good. Like we're good not being in charge." Okay. Coincidentally, like another big loser that we have talked about previously, not on the podcast, privately. Sorry guys, subscribe to our Patreon. We'll let you get that recording. Um Order and Progress. Another big loser. The future of Brazil.
Yeah, no,
Do
I
you want to
was
add on
just
that?
thinking, formulating my thoughts on this one because it's a very bold statement, but I think we've kind of been building towards in this conversation as well is with the polarization in Brazil, it's going to be harder for and the potential for I don't know, gridlock is more of an American term, but the inability, yeah, or the
Dysfunction.
inability of basically of Lula to deliver on some of his promises to the left, and or even to ameliorate some of the suffering of people, of the poorest people in Brazil. I mean, that's gonna not necessarily, he's not gonna be able to reduce inequality as much as people were hoping, and that is gonna make it easier for a right-leaning government to take power next time, and then really push things farther in ways that maybe Bolsonaro couldn't even, because people will, be the fear is people become disillusioned with the left because they couldn't deliver on all these promises, and then they're more willing to support a right-leaning government that is going to bulldoze the Amazon, and then we're all in trouble.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch this democracy handle this much dysfunction. Um, you,
And
being
it's
American,
not like Brazil is a stranger to dysfunction, but in what we're kind of looking at in the future is almost more status quo, or what's I'm struggling for the word, but it's stagnation basically, where there's just not, things aren't really improving, even if they're not getting significantly worse, they're just stagnant.
yeah, and that stagnation is going to be really interesting to watch because, like, I would not bet on the future getting better anywhere in the world currently. And so, who is going to be the big winners and losers of that bet is going to be really interesting. And watching, like, especially less developed countries than the West and North America handle this stagnation is going to be really interesting. I would not bet that there's this like magical solution either to this problem, as the UK found out the hard way.
That would be an interesting bet. Actually, we should do an episode on that, because I think there will be parts of Africa where things are really going to be changing in a really dramatic way. That's going to be really interesting to watch in the years ahead, like parts of Tanzania, or like Senegal, or Cameroon. Like there's going to be some really interesting countries that people don't really think twice about now, but for a variety of reasons that we can get into on an episode, are actually going to be interesting places. The top line being obviously that's where a lot of the growth in the future is going to happen, both demographically and otherwise. But there's a lot of unique circumstances in specific countries. And again, I'm talking very generally about a continent here, and that's not going to be uniform across the continent. But I think there will be parts where there will be some bright stories. So if so, not to be, at least for me, I'm not totally pessimistic about the future, but I think there will be interesting parts.
So
But in the
I
West,
remember
yeah, totally, it's
watching
gonna be shit.
and Asia, in the West and
Yeah.
Asia and South America. So I remember watching a Wendover Productions video on the Nile,
Yeah, shit. I haven't seen that, but shout out
and
to Wendover.
shout out to Wendover Productions and Ethiopia, and then researching like the progress that Ethiopia made, and I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like Africa's coming a long way, and you know, this past year Ethiopia's devolved into a civil war.
Yeah.
So I and Ethiopia devolved into a civil war before the war in Ukraine. And I think the issue that I have is the war in Ukraine is going to cause so much economic pain and food scarcity for the world that all bets are off.
Yeah, that's fair. And that combined with climate change and growing problems such as that, I mean, you really, yeah, you'll face some challenging situations in a lot of places for sure.
Right. So, anyway, back to Brazil. Okay, so what did I get wrong? I definitely underestimated Bolsonaro, and I underestimated how popular legislative legislative body, or like his coalition, or I guess rightists, would be in this election. Because when I was making my bet, I wasn't thinking would Bolsonaro win. I was thinking would Lula win in the first or second round. And an overwhelming majority of people who voted in the first election that had to switch sides for Bolsonaro. I did not see that coming.
Interesting.
You on
I
mute
guess I'm
there,
kind of
Kevin?
in the same. Sorry. Oh, say that again.
I was gonna say you on mute there.
Oh no,
Are you
I came
on
off.
mute?
No, that's a really good point, and I think I'm kind of in the same boat. Um, Even though I was initially more pessimistic about Lula's chances than you, I think even I kind of underestimated how popular Bolsonarismo is. I mean, I kind of definitely, I mean, just from knowing Brazilians, I guess, I definitely can appreciate that there is still a strong conservative movement, I guess you could say, or that those some of those ideas still have a lot of cachet amongst certain parts of the population. But I think I underestimated how beyond just kind of right leaning ideas, like how even just Bolsonaro's specific brand of conservatism was popular, even if he himself is not. So that was kind of an interesting change, and I don't know if that's because Lula was kind of so popular in many respects that it's like almost like a counterweight to that. But anyways, it's interesting that yeah that they did so well at the in the deputy elections.
Yeah, I guess the question is, did Lula do well and his party did poorly because they hate their party? Or did Lula do extremely poorly because of a hangover from Operation Car Wash as well? And his entire party.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that there are so many problems with that investigation now. Like, I mean, even with like Sergio Moro, the judge that was kind of behind a lot of those investigations, or a part of those investigations, like he was a part of Bolsonaro's government and then resigned after it was found that he, influenced the investigation in certain ways to politically benefit himself and parties against the PT, which was what led to Lula's ultimate exoneration. I think that there's so much controversy now around those elections, and not to say that corruption doesn't still linger, but it's almost like it seems like everyone is corrupt, right? Like even these guys who are supposed to investigate the corruption are corrupt. So I may as well go for the guy who at least promises me as a working class person like something. Like he's given me something, whereas what is Bolsonaro giving me beyond, pain and cuts?
Yeah, I think I think we'll have to do a little more research into that.
Yeah, with some numbers, I think, and some actual, because this is just kind of, I'm just going off feels at this point.
Okay. I think that's a good stopping point. I think we got it.
But yeah, no, this was a fun one, man. I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I'm gonna hit stop
I'm
recording.
gonna hit stop recording as well, but stay degenerate, everyone.